Brian May has described 1979 as a very dark time. He has said this in several interviews across the decades since, and each time he has said it with the specific brevity of someone who has chosen that particular phrase carefully, not because it is all there is to say, but because it is, for reasons he has not fully explained, the amount he has decided to say. Very dark. The year when Queen were, by almost every external measure, at the height of what they had built. The jazz album had been released in November 1978. The North American tour in the first months of 1979 was selling out stadiums across the continent. They were one of the biggest bands in the world, and the world knew it, and the tour was the proof. And Brian May, in the middle of all of this, was admitted to hospital with a duodenal ulcer. The tour was halted. The concerts were canceled. And Brian May, at 31 years old, in the year of Queen's greatest commercial momentum, spent time in a hospital bed. He has said it was very dark. He has not said much more than that. This video is going to sit with what he has not said, not to invent it, not to diagnose it, but to look carefully at the conditions of his life in 1979 and understand why very dark is the phrase he chose, and why he has never replaced it with something more complete. From the outside, 1979 was a year of extraordinary success for Queen. The jazz album had been released to the commercial success Queen had come to expect. It reached number 2 in the UK and number 6 in the US. The North American Jazz Tour of early 1979 was a full-scale stadium operation, the specific kind of touring that the scale of Queen's American following now required. From any reasonable commercial assessment, 1979 was Queen at the height of their achievement, consolidating the trajectory that had begun with Bohemian Rhapsody in 1975 and had accelerated with every subsequent release. The outside view was of a band at its peak. The inside view was something else. The specific physical event that brought Brian May's 1979 to a crisis was the development of a duodenal ulcer, a peptic ulcer in the first part of the small intestine, a condition associated with stress, with irregular eating, with the specific physical conditions that years of intensive touring produce in a body that is being managed around a schedule rather than around its own requirements. The North American Jazz Tour was interrupted. Concerts were canceled in April 1979. Brian May was hospitalized. The ulcer was the specific physical expression of something that his body had reached the limit of its capacity to manage. The duodenal ulcer is not a simple stress response. It requires sustained and significant physical pressure to develop. The accumulation of the conditions of a touring life across months and years rather than a single crisis. Brian May's body had been under the specific pressure of sustained intensive touring since the earliest years of Queen's career. The ulcer was the point at which the body said, "This is the limit." It was the physical statement of something that Brian May himself has hinted was not only physical. The ulcer was the body's statement, but the body does not develop a duodenal ulcer in 1979 at the peak of everything from physical pressure alone. The body reaches the limit of what it can manage when the total weight it is carrying, the physical, and the everything else exceeds what it has capacity for. Brian May has said it was very dark, not "I was physically unwell." Very dark. The dark was not the ulcer. The ulcer was the form the dark took when it expressed itself in a way the body could no longer contain. This is what Brian May has never fully explained, and this is why very dark is the phrase he chose. Brian May married Christine Mullen in 1974, when Queen's career was in its early acceleration. The marriage lasted until 1988 and produced 3 children. It was, by the accounts available, a marriage conducted in the conditions that intensive international touring imposes on a domestic life. Brian May absent for large parts of each year, the rhythms of family life organized around the career rather than the other way around. The difficulty of this kind of marriage is not simply the absence. It is the quality of the returning, the person who has been on the road, living the heightened existence of the touring rock star, returning to a domestic space that has continued without them, that requires the specific work of becoming a domestic person again. Brian May was managing this in 1979. He was managing, at 31, the question of who he was when he was not on stage. The answer was not, by the evidence of what he has said since, a comfortable one. 1979 was the year in which Freddie Mercury's personal life was becoming, gradually and then more rapidly, the life he had understood it to be rather than the life he had been living for professional reasons. The relationship with Mary Austin had shifted. The Munich chapter, which would fully open in the early 1980s, but was beginning its approach in the late 1970s, was visible to Brian May in the quality of his bandmates' life choices and personal decisions. Brian May was watching from the proximity of the person who had known Freddie Mercury since 1970, a person who was arriving at the conditions of greater personal freedom. And Brian May, at 31, in a marriage that was being managed across the specific structural difficulties of the touring life, was at a moment in his own life where the question of freedom, of what kind of life he was living and what kind of life he might have lived, was present in the specific uncomfortable way that it is present when you see someone else making a choice that illuminates your own unchoosing. This is speculation. Brian May has not said this, but the conditions were present, and conditions that are present in the life of a person under significant stress are the conditions that the stress is working on. The music that Brian May was writing and playing in the period around 1979 carries, if you listen with attention to the biographical context, some of the specific quality of what Very Dark sounds like in the form of a song. Leaving Home Ain't Easy, which appeared on the Jazz album and was written by Brian May, is a song about the specific difficulty of departure, not the romantic adventure of leaving, but the weight of what is left behind, the specific quality of someone who leaves, because the leaving is what the career requires, and who carries the leaving as something that costs rather than something that frees. The song is not autobiographical in a simple or direct sense, but it is not nothing either. It is the work of someone who is living the specific experience. It describes the man who leaves regularly, who is always arriving somewhere and always leaving somewhere, who has built a life that requires the constant departure from the things the life is also built around. This is what Brian May was writing in 1978 and performing in the early months of 1979 before the tour was halted. The music is one form of the evidence that something was being processed that the interviews have not contained. He wrote Leaving Home Ain't Easy. He wrote it in 1978 and performed it in the early months of 1979 before his body stopped the tour. The song is about what it costs to leave, about the weight of the constant departure, about what gets left behind when the career requires the leaving. Brian May wrote this song, and then his body produced a specific illness that is associated with sustained stress, and then he was hospitalized. He has said it was very dark. The song is one form of what very dark sounds like when it becomes music rather than a statement to an interviewer. The music said what the interviews have not. The phrase very dark does specific work. It is not. I was unwell describes a physical condition. It is not. It was a difficult year. Difficult describes a manageable thing that required effort. Very dark describes something that went beyond difficulty into the territory of darkness, the absence of light, the quality of a period in which the ordinary sources of orientation and meaning were not providing what they usually provide. Brian May has not expanded it significantly across multiple conversations. He has not described whether the darkness was about the marriage, the touring, the watching of Freddie Mercury's growing freedom, or his identity at 31, or some combination of all of these. The not expanding is itself information. A person through a simply physical illness would not choose very dark. The word is chosen precisely. Brian May has decided, across all the years since, that this is the most he is going to say. Brian May has described the period following the 1979 crisis as recovery and reorientation. The Game album, released in 1980, was Queen after the crisis, the first to reach #1 in the United States, producing Crazy Little Thing Called Love and another one, Bites the Dust. Brian May contributed to it with the quality of someone who had been through something and emerged with a slightly different orientation toward what the work was worth. Something had been resolved, not entirely, not permanently, but enough for the work to continue differently. The specific reason that Brian May has never fully explained what 1979 was about, why the darkness was the darkness it was, is something that can be approached from the outside but not entered from the outside. He has made a choice about what to say. The choice is consistent and sustained. He has said very dark, and he has said there were private difficulties that he does not discuss publicly, and he has not gone further. This is a legitimate choice. It is the same choice that Freddie Mercury made about the things he could not say directly, that Mary Austin has made about the things she was told in confidence, that the people closest to the people most visible to the world make when they understand that some things belong to the private life rather than the public record. Brian May understood this. He made the specific decision that the content of 1979, the specific weight of what made it very dark, was not material for public disclosure. And he has kept that decision for 45 years. The choice itself is a form of information. He chose very dark. He kept it there. And the keeping is the specific form of respect he has given to whatever the dark contained. He has kept it for 45 years. Very dark. The phrase he chose in 1979 and has not replaced since. A person who has spent 45 years deciding not to explain something has made a deliberate decision about what belongs to the private life and what belongs to the public record. Brian May made this decision in 1979 and has honored it consistently. The keeping is not evasion. The keeping is the specific form that the private life takes when the person living it understands that some things are not for the world to have. He kept it. He is still keeping it. Very dark, nothing more. The 1979 crisis illuminates something about Brian May that the public portrait sometimes underemphasizes. He is understood primarily as the guitarist, the extraordinary technician, the creator of the Red Special, the author of solos that are among the most studied in rock music. He is understood as the intellectual of Queen, the person who kept the band going after Freddie Mercury died. What is less understood is the specific cost of all of this, the personal cost of the touring life, the marriage and its difficulties, the question of who Brian May was at 31 when his body said stop. The 1979 crisis is the visible edge of the private struggle of a person who had given enormous amounts of himself to his work and who reached in 1979 the specific point at which something had to give. There is one other element of Brian May's 1979 that deserves attention, though its connection to the crisis must be held lightly. His relationship with his father, Harold May. Harold May had helped Brian build the Red Special from a fireplace surround in assorted parts when Brian was 16. He had initially been uncertain about the rock music career. He had come to support it. The specific quality of that relationship, the father and son who built something together, who had negotiated the tension between the expected path and the chosen one, was a relationship that Brian May has described as central to who he is. In 1979, Harold May was alive, and the question of what it meant to be Brian May, not the guitarist, but the person who had built the guitar with his father and chosen this life, was a question that the 1979 crisis would have brought to the surface. Very dark. The body statement. The music about leaving. The private life he has never fully described. The guitar built with his father. The watching of Freddie Mercury's Growing Freedom. The marriage managed across the specific structural difficulties of the touring life. Brian May at 31, at the peak of everything, hospitalized in the dark. He came out of it. He made the game. He made the extraordinary music that the next decade of Queen produced. He carried whatever the dark had been through everything that followed. And he chose two words for it. Very dark. He has kept them for 45 years. The keeping is the measure of what they contain. In 1979, Brian May had a breakdown at the peak of Queen's fame. His body stopped the tour. He spent time in hospital. He has described the year as very dark. He has not explained what very dark contained, not in any public forum, not in any of the extensive interviews he has given across the 45 years since. He has made a choice about this, and the choice has been consistent and sustained, and the consistency tells you that what he chose not to say is something he has never stopped knowing is there and has never stopped choosing to keep private. The world knows Brian May as the guitarist, the intellectual, the person who kept going. What the world does not know, because Brian May has decided it does not need to know, is the specific quality of the darkness he carried through the peak of everything in 1979. He came out of it. He made extraordinary music. He built from whatever the very dark contained a life that has continued across 45 years of extraordinary things. Very dark. 2 words. The most he has said, the measure of everything he has kept.